social class and stratification in social class. This was the last thing I wanted to cover here. I'm not going to go through this. We already covered the order approach, that fellow Kingsley Davison and Wilbur Moore. Then the conflict approach. This is the third theory of stratification of Max Weber's. I'm not going to go through it in too much. I'm going to let you guys basically resort or go to your textbooks. 3 dimensions. It's multidimensional analysis of class. Okay, so class for him isn't just your economic status, and he has a certain way of looking at the how economic resources determines your class status. In a way that's a little different from Marx's. We're not going to worry about that. Then he's also interested in the cultural dimensions of your class status. So how culture is going to affect your worldview, the way you speak, the way you carry yourself, your taste in clothes, a whole bunch of dimensions that we think of as cultural. And he's going to suggest that when you create a culture around a class or on top of a class, and he calls that a status group, that can lead to an in-group sort of dynamic in which a class acts as a group that identifies, its members identify with one another, okay, and identify in contrast with other groups. So you can begin to see intergroup relations of distrust, of distance, of a sense of defensiveness, maybe animosity, et cetera, okay? And this can lead to a kind of class, as it were, what's the word, struggle, dynamics between classes, and so on. And then the last element is that of power. Okay, and I'm not going to go ahead and move this. It's class, it's status or culture, and then power is the last element of class. And here he poses the question: if a class that begins simply by sharing an income level or a wealth level begins to act like a group with a unique culture all its own, a unique way of looking at the world, set of values, and so on, is it the case that they can then get their act together, to use a term, have a sense of solidarity, and actually act in concert, act as a single group to defend its interests at the expense of other classes? Okay, so to put it more crudely, will you see a kind of class warfare in which those on the top that have the greatest amount of resources actually use their resources, okay, to exercise power in their own interest and perhaps to the detriment of other classes, right? Put even more crudely, will wealthy people try to use governmental power to gain advantages and to put themselves in a good spot, okay, to the cost of those below them, right? So we may have a number of intuitions about whether or not that's true. That might seem right to you. It might seem a little too skeptical. You may think it paints the world in a too black and white kind of way, but then you can ask, what does the data suggest? I'm going to show you 2 kinds of data. By the way, let me just stop here and tell you what I'm all going to cover here within the next hour. So I'm going to talk about a piece of research that was done regarding the link between class and power, governmental power in particular. Then I'm going to talk about trends in inequality in the United States, how we measure that inequality, and then how we explain it. Okay, and that's pretty much it. So what this shows up here, these little thingies in this kind of ugly yellow color, orange color, this is from a couple decades ago already, but what it shows is the percentage of people from the upper 1% as measured, I believe, by income, right? So a thin slice of the population at the very top in terms of income, what is their percentage or proportion in kind of the leadership or control modules of the most important positions in the economy and in the government? So what these are up here are really important mega companies, corporations back in the day, industries producing, you know, cars, steel, you name it, banks, investment banks, stock that deal in stocks and bonds and so on, insurance company, transportation companies, including you know, automotive industries, but also airlines, and then utilities would be things like gas, energy, right? All this. Anyway, these numbers up here simply say of the people on the board of members are like the decision makers of these big companies. Okay, they make the huge decisions. What are we going to make? What are we going to pay our employers? How many people are going to work for us? All those kinds of things. Of the 1% of the population, the 1% represented 54, 62, 44, 53% of people on those boards come from the top 1% of the population. Okay, so they're vastly overrepresented. Okay, and again, why is that relevant? It might be relevant if you're asking the question, what kind of difference does it make, or what kind of influence might the wealthiest class, the most resource wealthy class, have over the rest of society? Okay, and so this might be indirect evidence that they exercise a great deal of control. What this is over here, these little figures, these are president appointed positions. Okay, so Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasurer, Secretary of Defense, right? I think Secretary of State, I think, is a guy named Mike Pompeo, right? So if you're familiar with his name, he was somebody, right? He serves in the administration or the cabinet of President Trump. He wasn't voted, he was appointed. He was picked by the president. Well, so if you take a look, this fellow named Kerbo, back in the day, he was the one who was tallying up these numbers, and he asked of Secretary of States, Secretary of the Treasurers, that's Larry Kudlow, I believe, right now. Secretary of Defense, can't remember what that fellow's name is right now. I don't know if anybody happens to know off the top of their heads. Should know that. But so these numbers, 60%, this is since World War II. What percentage of people appointed in these positions have come from the top 1% of the income, right? And it's 2/3. Okay, so what does that tell you? All that stuff tells you that in government and in the private sector, during this slice of time, post-World War II, you know, in a couple decades ago, in the economy, it's mostly, right? It's mostly the top 1% that's making up or composing, okay, sort of the control panels, I'm using that metaphor, of the economy and of government, okay? So in other words, compared to, you know, what's out there in the general population, they're way overrepresented. Now, that doesn't actually tell you anything. Does that mean just because they're represented, say, and they, right? So what are their powers? Their powers are the ability to enact laws, to legislate, to re-legislate, to interpret the laws and so on, to enforce them and the like. Does that mean that they're actually going to make decisions that are good for the class they belong to and not necessarily good for the other classes. Okay, that actually, you can't answer that question by just looking at these data. Okay, so this here, I want to introduce to you, this is not from your textbook. Martin Gillens, a political scientist, made a splash by first giving the first kind of evidence of something like sort of a bias towards the upper end of the income distribution, the upper classes. That it was the idea that when government, and we're talking in particular the federal government, right? So on Capitol Hill, Congress, the Senate, and the House, are actually answering to mostly the top 1%, the top slice, okay? Maybe not 1%, but the top 10%, because that's the figures that are used here. But what this is, it's a measure of responsiveness of government to different segments of the population. How much do they listen? How much do they take into account the wishes and the preferences of their constituencies, right? The people who are responsible for electing them. And so what he did is he gathered all kinds of data. First of all, he looked at several decades of different decisions that were made in Congress, laws passed regarding tax policy, changing the tax policy structure, foreign affairs, whether to wage war and invest money in, certain military campaigns in this part of the world or that part of the world. Legislation of a more quote-unquote social nature having to do with, say, eligible marriage categories, gay marriage, you name it, okay? Whatever it happens to be, or it could be health insurance, for example, okay? And then what he did is he was able to get data, questionnaire data on people's preferences related to their income level. Okay, so what do voters care about? Are they for this kind of legislation or against this kind of legislation? And where are they? Are they poor? Are they wealthy? Are they in the middle? And so on and so forth. And what you do, okay, these graphs, here's what these graphs show. Take a look at these. You have the dotted line, and then you have the solid line. The solid line, 90th percentile, that means the top. It's the top 10% of income. The 10th percentile is the bottom 10%, right? So it's like the wealthy and the poor. And as you move to the right, from 0 to 100%, what that means is for the poor, the lowest 10% of income, 100% means everyone is agreed, okay, that let's say, we want to lower taxes. So 100%. Okay, agree we want to lower taxes. The idea is that if 100% of voters of a category want to lower taxes, if democracy is working the way it's supposed to in theory, okay, a person elected represents, okay, the people that vote them in, right? Their actions are supposed to reflect the will of the people that elect them, right? That's the idea. That's what representative democracy is supposed to be. Okay, so you're basically just a representative, okay, of the person and their wishes, who voted you in. Anyway, and then what this shows is, does it make a difference? What is the likelihood that as a segment of the population begins to show consensus, they all agree that they want something. They want taxes lowered, okay? If you just have a few people, I mean, maybe the representative in Congress isn't going to do it. Very few people, it's a minority position. But as soon as everybody wants something, they're like, well, I better reflect, you know, the wishes of my constituency, okay? What is the likelihood that everyone agreeing on a position is going to make the representative, okay, vote that way? And what you see here, okay, is basically a measure of responsiveness of elected officials. Okay, and so notice this is a flat line. It's a flat line, okay? That's a good way of putting it. What this shows is that it doesn't seem to make any difference whether or not the bottom 10% feel strongly about a particular issue. Congress it's not going to increase the likelihood that elected officials are going to respond, okay, to those wishes. At the top 90%, as the top 90% begin to get their act together and feel strongly about something, that increases the likelihood that Congress is going to respond. Okay, so to put this graph, the message behind this graph really crudely, okay, as the wealthy start making a lot of noise, Congress responds. As poor people start making a lot of noise, Congress doesn't even know they're making any noise. Okay? Okay, so that's essentially what this is demonstrating. Okay. Now, what Gillen said is he goes, look, you may not be surprised by that, okay? Congress not listening to poor people, but listening to wealthy people, maybe you're not surprised at all, because poor people probably don't even have anything to say, or they're not able to like get their voices, okay, mentioned anyway, okay? But how about if you take the top 90 percentile and compare them to the middle class? Surely the middle class, okay, will have something to say, or will be listened to. And it turns out if you take the middle class, the 50th, right in the middle, it looks about the same. The difference in responsiveness to Congress is pretty much the same as it is between the wealthy, okay, and the poor. Okay, so this made a big splash because you may have already had this suspicion. Congress is only responsive to, they only make laws in favor of, okay, those who have the money, who are able to wield influence to maybe finance campaigns and so on of people in Congress. But this was the first time that there was really evidence demonstrating that, okay? So, I mean, very, very important to know that if you're a citizen of a society, to be sort of armed with knowledge that that's in fact the way the system works, okay? Because with that knowledge, then you can actually say, I know what's going on, I know how this works, and you can actually tell this, okay, to your representatives, okay, and say, listen, you may not even think you're being influenced in the way that you actually are, but here's what the numbers say, so you may begin to be in a position to make demands that they act in a way that's more responsive to the general population. Okay, so let me now go on to the next set of stuff. Okay, so regarding class, let me just tell you right out, let's see, yeah, I think this is the one we want here. Sorry, guys. Okay, is that? Sure, text box. Slide 3. Where's the slide I want? Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah, tell you what, I'm gonna make this really quick. Let me first just tell you that in terms of overall trends in the United States, there was this term that has been used. Okay. Long story short, over the last century, what we've seen in the United States in terms of the distribution of income and wealth, okay, measures of inequality, is that in the first decades of the previous century, the 1900s, there was an escalation and then a peak in inequality of income and wealth, and that was followed by a decline with World War II. And in the next couple decades, 2 to 3 decades, there was continued decline in inequality, and then beginning in the early 1970s and continuing to 2020, this month, okay, we have seen a resumption, okay, in the rise of inequality according to all the kinds of measures that are used, and we'll take a look at what those measures are. This has sometimes been called, let's see if I'm able to draw here, the Great U-turn, and what that refers to is the following. If you can see that, this little, in industrialized societies, Great Britain, the United States, France, and so on and so forth, what you saw was, historically, with the advent of industrialization, you saw increases in inequality for many decades, and then they reached a peak, after which there were declines in inequality, okay, in Great Britain, in France, in Italy, throughout the industrialized world, and in the United States as well. So in the United States, this peak was reached in the 1920s, in the so-called Roaring Twenties. This was referred to often as the Gilded Age. For reasons I won't go into, it actually comes from a book that was written by Mark Twain and somebody, a co-author of his, shortly after the end of Reconstruction following the Civil War. But the Gilded Age referred to high levels of inequality, gross forms of inequality in the United States. And then with World War II, you saw a decline until about so this is an inverted U, an upside down U. And then what happened around the early 1970s, mid to late 1970s, we've seen a resumption in levels of inequality to this very day, okay, 2020. Okay, so that's what's happened in the United States. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and show you guys just a few of the ways in which you actually measure this. So this kind of U-turn, where does this come from? Where can you get these kinds of numbers? And here we go. Let's see. Up. Slide 3, that's not what I want, that's not what I want, that's not what I want. I got tons and tons of slides. So this PowerPoint is available to you in the module section, also in the week 8 module. And there's all kinds of, I've been nuts on the different graphs, and actually it should actually be updated. I should try to get stuff that's rather from 2013, from 2020, and in fact, I was tempted to go on to like the Pew data site that shows some updated figures on inequality, but they tell the same story. So the story has not changed since the kinds of data you're seeing here. In any event, let me just give you, what are some measures of inequality? Okay, I'm going to talk about 3 measures of inequality that I want you guys to be aware of. There's the median / mean gap. It's a ratio of 2 statistics. Okay, what is the median? A median is like the middle term. If you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 numbers, okay, it's the number right in the middle. It's the number right in the middle. Okay, so if you have all kinds of different, individuals who make different incomes, the median income is going to be the income that's right in the middle. Okay, and there's going to be as many incomes, individual income figures above and as are below. Okay, so that's the median. The average is not the median. So the mean means the average. Okay, what is the average? It's when you add up all these different figures, right? You add these up, okay, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 4, 4, 9. And let's say these 9 figures add up to 20, right? And you divide it by 9, right? Okay, so you got 18 and 20. Right, so it's going to be like 2.2 or whatever. If it added up to 15, it's going to be less, right? So you can have all kinds of, you can have the same median, okay? But you could have different averages despite having the same median. And it turns out that people who study inequality or income distribution, how is income distributed, how is wealth distributed in different societies, you can actually get some insight from looking at the ratio between that middle number and the averages. And here's one thing, when you begin to see over time the ratios change, that can be informative. So if over time in the United States, what we've seen is that the mean, okay, the ratio actually grows. So the mean over the median, if that ratio grows, what that indicates is that incomes at the top are swelling. You have more incomes at the top, which are bigger and bigger and bigger. What that does is it enlarges the mean, it enlarges the average, and it pulls it away from the median. Okay, and so that's what we've seen in the United States. This shows an earlier, this guy, Edward N. Wolf, he's somebody famous for examining US inequality, and he likes this statistic. Okay, and he's done work over the years at intervals. So I'm sure he's done studies closer to the present than this, and he's continued to see the same kind of thing. Okay, so that's one way of that. Okay, so the mean to the median, and that's been increasing. Here's another way. You can simply use kind of the slice of the pie, right? Where you have, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So you've got income, and then you've got different slices. And you say, so if you got 5 slices, that means each slice represents 20% of the population, okay? So if you have 100 people, okay, you slice it up into 20 from top to bottom, and you ask how much of the income is accounted for by the 20th percent, okay? And then what is the ratio of the top of the biggest to the smallest 20%, okay? That's called an income or a wealth shares ratio. And that's a very common kind of intuitive way. So let's see. These are old figures now. Here are two countries that have relatively high income shares ratios. The US, 12-1. Okay, so for income, how much bigger is the top 20% than the bottom 20%? 12 times. Okay. And then, you know, if your question is that a lot? I don't know. I don't know what to compare it with. Well, you compare it to other countries. So China's, I think, is now lower than the United States. Brazil's is higher. Brazil's is very high. But if you take a look right immediately to the north, Canada's is considerably lower than the United States. So the United States is quite high by this measure. Okay. So that's a second, the wealth shares. And then the last one is called the Gini coefficient. It's pronounced Gini. It's an Italian pronunciation from the name of the fellow who developed the statistic. And the way this one works is the following. What you have is it's some number between 0 and 1. 0 is an impossible figure. 0 means there's no inequality, or it means that, you know, if you have the we did the 5 shares, that everyone has exactly the same amount. $10, $10, $10, $10, $10. Okay. If there's $50 in a society and 5 people, they all have $5. Or if there's 5 people in a society and there's $50, they all have $10. Right. Okay. So 0. If the United States was 0, we would all have, if the average income, I think the average is something like 7 for a household. I believe it's 70,000. I can't remember if it's like individuals or households, but the average is 70,000. Okay, that would mean every single person had $70,000. But we know that's not it, right? In fact, what we know is we have some people who have literally billions, hundreds and billions of dollars, and some people who have hardly any, right? So, but the average still comes out the same. And that brings us back to this idea of the median versus the mean gap, okay, or ratio, okay? At the other end would be a society in which one person has all the wealth and nobody else has any, okay? Another impossible figure. So what you normally see is something in between there, right? You're going to see on the low end, you're going to see something like 0.20. At the higher end, you're going to see something like 0.70. That'd be really high. Okay. Okay. Where is the United States? The United States is relatively high. They have a high Gini index, and you can actually take a look if you want right now. In fact, let me do this just as an exercise. Let me go and see what I can find for the Gini index right now. Gini index by country. What do I want to take here? How about, let me just take this thing, World Bank estimate. So there's a big, okay. So here are the kinds of numbers they're using. It's 0.63 and so on. So that's really at the high end of things. Where are we at towards the low in the 0.25%? Trying to see if I could find the United States. There we are, 41% according to that measure. Okay. So you can do that yourself. You can look around. Yeah, I haven't talked about the minimum wage. That's another way in which you can, okay, and by the way, I forgot to mention this. One of the things that we've seen in the United States, so I've mentioned that inequality has increased, and what that's involved, part of what that's involved is when you adjust for inflation in comparing different years, comparing incomes from year to year. And what you do is you say, oh, in today's dollar, what would you have been able to buy, back 2 decades ago, and so on. So you adjust for inflation. What you find out is incomes have, from the middle, from like the median down, they've more or less stayed the same. Okay. Even though as a country, okay, total income as measured by what they call gross national or gross domestic product has been growing. There's been some years like Great Recession in which you might actually see negative growth. Okay. But over the long haul, we've continued to grow, and we're a wealthier country, a considerably wealthier country than we were just 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, and 4 decades ago. So if we're wealthier, considerably wealthier, but incomes have stagnated, have stayed the same from middle downward, what does that mean? That means all the growth in income has gone, okay, from the middle upwards, okay? And that's partly reflected in the idea that like the minimum wage, okay? What's its value today compared to what it was in the past when you adjust for inflation, and actually it's dropped, okay? By the way, there's been a sort of movements at the state level. Different states have been on their own initiative adjusting the minimum wage, in many places raising it just in the last few years, okay? But states vary enormously, especially from north to south, but just even, Indiana to say Minnesota, for example. Okay, okay, let's see. I got all kinds of graphs. This graph here, if you wanted to, you could actually take a look. This actually displays what I just said, hourly wages. And this is like these percentiles. This is the bottom wage. This is the top wage by certain, what they call percentiles. And what you notice is that you go from 1973 to 2007, and what you see is from the middle, from the 50%, even 60% and downwards, you see either no change or you see a loss of income. And what you see is all the gains are at the top, okay, in terms of hourly wages, okay? So you can actually see the data in a really concrete, detailed kind of way by looking at that graph. I just wanted to show you. You don't have to know these graphs, but they're there. This slide is a mess, don't worry about it, but it does show the same kind of things, that gains in income have mostly been enjoyed at the top, less so at from the middle downward. This graph is very interesting because this shows that U-turn, okay? So it shows top 10%, top 5%, top 1% of the income. Those at the top 1%, what this shows is from 1922 to 2002, what percentage of total income did they make? So in 1922, the top 1% made about, well, at the top, they made close to 20% of the income, right? And then what you see is after World War II and all the way down to the 1970s, that dropped. The portion that the top, okay, 1% were representing was declining, and then it's resumed, Okay, and if we push this out towards 2020, we would see the same kind of thing. So this is that U-turn I was talking about. And actually, that's all I want to say. Okay, no more demonstration. You can take a look at the graphs yourself if you would like. Okay, sort of to, I guess, substantiate that picture of increasing inequality, stagnation in the middle and below, increases all, you know, from the middle and above, especially, and the more so as we move to the top. That there is this last one, this is CEO compensation, so the chief executive officer, right? So top management in companies, and you've probably already heard this before, but what is on average, how much more do they make than the average worker in their own company? Back in 1965, the CEO on average made 24 times more in salary than the people that, you know, their employees did. That was 1965. That's quite a bit, you know, making 24 times more than another person. That's a lot more than another person. But then what you see is in the early 2000s, it shoots up. Actually, it shoots up as high as 500 times as much. Okay. And what's interesting to note about that is that's unique in the world. That's a special thing. Okay. In other wealthy nations, you don't find that. So actually in Japan, it's remained about 24. So the United States back in 1965, they were sort of normal, quote unquote, compared to other countries. They become abnormal, as it were, when it comes to CEO compensation. And that raises, you know, interesting questions. Okay, why would that be? And people have come up with various explanations. Very few of them, to many people, satisfying. What this shows here is, I'm not going to go through this, but how do you actually arrive at those numbers, the Gini coefficient numbers between 0 and 1? Let me go to, I'm going to mention 3 explanations. Okay. And here, I'm actually going to stop with these explanations. And what I'll do on Thursday is there's this thing called the Great Gatsby curve, which ties together a couple things. It ties together what's called social mobility and measures of social mobility, and sees if there's anything linking increasing inequality to levels of social mobility. And that's important, and I'll explain why that's important as well. Okay, but I just want to stop with this today. What are some explanations? What accounts for the fact that the United States, after becoming really unequal, started becoming more equal, right? Income became more and more shared, okay, after World War II, but then we've resumed, okay, to greater levels of inequality. What this shows right here are 3 explanations. And there's more than this as well, okay? But these are 3 of the big ones. One big one is changes in technology that requires fewer workers to produce certain kinds of things. So mostly like automation, the use of robots and other, you know, things to do work that used to require workers. And here's the deal. So if in a factory making cars, you used to require 100 workers, and for 100 workers, now it's reduced to half as much because of automation, what's the effect of that? It could be that those factory jobs were really well paying. And in fact, they were. So factory labor became really, you know, paid really well in the United States after World War II. Okay, there was a rise in income in those kinds of jobs. And then as those jobs started disappearing because of automation, okay, the idea is that people who would have been working in those well-paying jobs now found other jobs that didn't pay as well. Okay, so they weren't able to substitute in jobs that paid as well. So like in the service sector, for example, working in restaurants or whatever it might be. Even those jobs that are like quote unquote highly skilled in the sense that they require a certain amount of education and so on in the information technology sector, those may not be as well compensating as classic factory labor was. Okay, so there's that. Yeah, and so if you take a look here, back in the early 1960, 1/4 of workers in the United States worked in those factories. Okay, what it is today, I'm certain it's less than 11% today, but right, so it's declined by a good half amount. Here's another thing in the United States: unionization. So being a member of a union, what does that mean? It means you join this club with fellow workers, and the deal is that part of this club, you set aside a little bit of money through fees. You pay a little bit out of your salary, and then the deal is when workers start wanting something that their employers aren't giving them. We want higher pay. We want, $2 more this year. We want these health benefits. We want these protections. We want this break. We want, paid vacation. We want this, that, and the other thing. If you make those demands individually by yourself, you don't have much of a bargaining position, right? If you got two people who are arguing over compensation, and one of them is extremely wealthy and one of them, is just kind of living from day to day, the person who's living from day to day isn't in a very good bargaining position. They got to get back to work, right? So they can't hold out for very long. But if you pool all your resources, you're in a better bargaining position, right? Okay. And in the United States, the unions began to enter the manufacturing sector in a huge way in the 1930s. And they began to make a lot of gains in income, health insurance, all that kind of stuff. And then what we've seen is a decline in union membership, okay, ever since then to this very day. So I believe right now in the United States, the union membership peaked at the mid 30s, so 35 or so percent of workers were members of unions at its peak, and today it's less than 10%. Okay, and that's really low compared to many other countries. Okay, many other wealthy countries. So declining unionization levels, there's an entire story to tell. You could do a whole semester on the role of the unions, why union membership has declined in the United States. And it's a very important story for understanding these things. We can't really do that, but just suffice it to say, actually, there's a picture, I think. Let me, oh, shoot, what just happened? Slide 17. Need to go down here. Slide 20. Yeah, this shows, so right after World War II, the United States peaked, and it's been going downhill in terms of unionization ever since. Okay. Okay. Finally, changes in tax policy. Okay, and again, there's all kinds of details that we're not going to be able to go through right now, but long story short is, what is progressive taxation used? That's actually a term that's used to describe kinds of taxes that national governments leverage on their populations. Progressive simply means income scaled. It means you pay more as income increases. So that's progressive. The reason they use that term progressive is for historical reasons. It has to do with certain kinds of political movements in the United States towards the beginning of the previous century. Regressive taxation would be either insensitive to income, so it would be like a flat one paid 10% of their income in taxes, whether they made $5,000 a year or $500 billion a year, if everyone was paying 10%, that would be a regressive tax because it would not be income sensitive. It would be regressive if you paid a greater percent of your income and you made less than a wealthy person, right? That would be super regressive. And that hasn't really been done, I think, since feudal times. But long story short is American tax policy has become less and less progressive. Okay. In a dramatic way beginning in the early 1980s. Okay. And this can be demonstrated in the following way. Let me demonstrate it with just one graph. If you take a look at this graph, oh shoot, I wish I had, I should have brought it out before. I can never remember all the tax brackets. So a tax bracket is like, okay, depending on how much you make in a given year, you end up in this little tax bracket. And that basically tells you how much income you owe to either the federal government or the state government or what have you. So your federal income taxes. And what they do is it's usually like this. Usually say the first $20,000 up till $20,000, you're only going to pay 10% of that. The next $10,000 from 20,000 to 30,000, that 10,000, you're going to pay a higher percentage on that slice. And then the next slice, you're going to pay a higher percentage. That's how the tax brackets work. Okay? And the very top one in the United States right now is, what is it? I want to say it's 30, something like 36%. Geez, it was 39% and then it got changed. So what this shows, this line right here is that top, the very, very top percentage from 19, and here's what I want you to notice. Ooh, look at it shoots way up. What that means, that top percentage, that's to big earners, people with big salaries, okay, or with lots and lots of wealth. And you know, oh, World War I, it looks like we suddenly wanted to raise a bunch of new taxes, and what you do is you raise the top tax bracket, the top, it's called a marginal tax. Don't worry why you call it marginal. And then it drops down as soon as the war ends. Notice that it goes way back up again during the Great Depression, and then with World War II, to fund World War II, but also to fund a number of programs, federal programs meant to combat the devastation, economic devastation of the Great Depression. Things like Social Security, unemployment benefits, and so on. Okay. In other words, the top marginal rate means you start skimming more off the top of the top earners. That's what that means. Okay. And what you notice is this. World War II, it stays pretty high, 90%. And by the way, probably what this was like back in 1942 or whatever, if, I don't know, if you're a millionaire, and it'd be kind of like, okay, after $1 million, every dollar you earn after 1 million, we get 95 cents out of that dollar, right? So it's almost like saying, you know, you can go ahead, you can only be so wealthy, right? That's kind of what it means in a way, at least in terms of your income. Okay, there's other wealth is something different than income. Okay, but anyway, notice that it takes a drop. Early 1980s, it takes a drop. So now instead of 90 or 70%, it's been in the 30s ever since then. Okay, and what that has meant essentially is that less and less of the total tax burden, okay, or revenue by the federal government, with which the federal government does all kinds of stuff, okay? Build roads, institute infrastructure, do job training, fund the military, all that stuff, right? Okay, less and less of that federal revenue comes from top incomes, okay? By the way, you could tell the same story for corporate taxes as well. Taxes that corporations pay, that's also been declining, okay? And more of those taxes is actually picked up by people lower down in the income distribution, okay? So those are just three factors that people have pointed to as contributing together, okay? There's other ones as well, even things like changing marriage patterns, where you have more and more people or spouses sorting themselves out by economic and educational levels. So more and more top earners, top education levels will match up, okay, than in the past. There used to be a little bit more mixture, okay, economically than there is now. And there's other things to talk about as well, but those are probably the three big ones. Tax policy, unionization levels, and technological changes have all been advanced as major contributors to changes in inequality in the United States. Then there's another question, and this is the question that I'm going to address on Thursday when we talk about the so-called Great Gatsby curve. The question is that good? Is that fair? Is that bad? That there's been this increase in inequality? Because maybe it's not. Maybe it's not bad at all. Because maybe you could make an argument if you wanted to, that somebody at the very bottom of this very unequal ladder, call it a ladder, okay, could be better off today than somebody who was higher up the ladder back in 1970s, just because overall we're much more wealthy. And that the inequality itself doesn't tell you anything about people's standards of living, relative to where they're located. So there's that argument. And then you could also say, just because there's inequality, does that mean that we're acting more like an estate or a caste system rather than a class system? Does it mean that people who got to the top and earned all that money don't deserve all that money that they earned and deserve to be at the top? And the Great Gatsby curve is going to be, it's not going to be able to directly answer that question, but it's going to give us a little clue, an indirect suggestion as to how to answer that kind of question.